So let's take a quick look at this timeline on the Civil War. In 1860, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede. In 1861, on February 8th, there's a formation of the new country called the Confederate States of America. You can see on this map, everything in dark blue is the United States of America. Red is the Confederate States of America, and yellow is what we call the border states, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And these black areas out here are territories. They are not part of the United States yet. So February of 1861, we have the Confederate States of America formed. They even created their own constitution and their own currency. On April 12, 1861, we had the first battle of the Civil War, which was at Fort Sumter. The Confederate Army, who were looking for supplies, attacked the fort. It was a surprise attack. No one was killed, but the Union Army retreated immediately, and the Civil War officially began on this date. Let's talk a little bit about Tennessee. Tennessee seceded in 1861. It took us so long to secede because we were split, we were divided. East Tennessee was strongly against secession, while Western Tennessee wanted to break away. There are various reasons for that. The biggest reason is our political beliefs and also the belief in slavery. In East Tennessee, we did not have large plantations where we depended on large numbers of slavery. And actually, if you owned a slave in East Tennessee, it was usually just one or two, and they were seen as like luxuries. And so people in East Tennessee didn't really understand, what's the big point of having slaves? Let's free them. It was not that big a deal to them. Whereas in Western Tennessee, the people felt more strongly about slavery because they did have larger farms and they were more dependent on the use of slaves to work the farm. The division between East and West actually became so big that East Tennessee threatened to secede from the state of Tennessee. They wanted to secede and create their own state that would be loyal to the Union. Western Tennessee and Middle Tennessee alike would not let this happen, though, and they actually sent in troops in 1861 to keep East Tennessee from seceding from the state of Tennessee. However, they finally had an open vote for secession, and through a very slim margin, we decided as a state through the vote to secede from the Union. However, it says right here that throughout the war, many Tennesseans still fought and helped on the side of the Union. And something that most people don't really think about is that due to where Tennessee is located, right in the middle between North and South, we saw more battles than any other state in the United States except for Virginia. Next, we come to the Battle of Antietam. This is a really horrible battle, a very sad day in U.S. history. It was the first battle fought on northern soil, but the thing that it's mostly known for is it's the deadliest day in U.S. history. In one day, 26,000 soldiers on the northern side and the southern side died in this battle, just in one day, the Battle of Antietam. After the Battle of Antietam, we had the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm sorry, I have a little cold and I'm having trouble talking. President Lincoln issued an executive order known as the Emancipation Proclamation, and it proclaimed the immediate freedom of all slaves in the rebel states. Now, this did not free all slaves in all states, because it did not apply to any slaves in the 5 bordering states. They are light blue on this map right here. And this was mostly a political ploy from Lincoln. He did not free all slaves at this one time because he did not want to take the chance of any of these border states going to seceding from the Union and going down to help the South. Now, what the border states are slave states that did not want to secede from the Union. All of these dark blue states that on this map are considered a part of the United States of America are all states that abolished slavery. All of the red states are states that did not abolish slavery and seceded from the Union to fight in the Civil War. However, these border states, these light blue states, were states that wanted to stay loyal to the Union but did not want to abolish slavery. So it was a very, very kind of tricky point here, and he knew that he could not abolish slavery throughout the United States just yet because he could not risk losing these states to the Confederacy. We have many battles happening, but another big one that you've probably heard of is the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg is the deadliest battle in the Civil War. We say that Antietam is the deadliest day in Civil War, in the history of the Civil War. But Gettysburg is the deadliest battle in the Civil War. And over a 3-day period, 51,000 soldiers were killed. The South lost and fled back to Virginia, and this was actually a key turning point in the war because it ended Robert E. Lee's campaign north. It pushed him back south, and so it ended his movement north. Next, we have the Gettysburg Address. And one thing I want you to realize about the Gettysburg Address is it did not happen right after the Battle of Gettysburg. Most people think that it did, but it actually happened 4 months, almost 4.5 months after the battle happened. And what was happening at this point was, Gettysburg, everyone, North and South, they knew that this was just a horrific event. And, 50,000 people died in that battle. And what they were doing on November 19th, 1863, is they were doing a dedication and a remembrance at the site of where the battle was to kind of just remember and give reference to all of those people who lost their lives during that horrible battle. And there was a number of people who spoke during this event that happened. However, President Lincoln's speech was by far the biggest speech that happened that day and is one of the best known speeches in U.S. history. Next we have, and this is the final battle that I'm going to talk about in this little recap, and that is actually not even the battle. After the battle at Appomattox Courthouse is the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And what I want to show you is a short little video that talks about the final days, the final few weeks of the Civil War, and what was happening on both sides, what was going on in the minds of the generals and the presidents and even the people who were living during this time.
During the Civil War, the two government capitals, Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, were barely 100 miles apart. But despite attempts and missed opportunities on both sides, neither army posed any serious threat to the other's capital. That is, until Union forces won a decisive victory near Petersburg on April 1st, 1865. Petersburg, which protected and supplied the capital, had been under siege by Union General Ulysses S. Grant since June of 1864. Meanwhile, General William T. Sherman was heading north following his successful march to the sea, putting even more pressure on Lee. By March 1865, it was becoming clear that Petersburg was lost and Richmond was at risk. Confederate General Robert E. Lee abandoned Petersburg and advised an evacuation of Richmond on Sunday, April 2, 1865. People rushed about in frenzied anticipation of the arriving Northern troops, but because of the damage inflicted to the region's railroads, there was only one open rail line. Wealthy residents clamored for space on outbound trains that struggled under their burdens. While some sources say the family of Confederate President Jefferson Davis had left the city much earlier, other sources report that the South's First Lady was caught up in the bedlam, and that the steam engine carrying her actually broke down and spent the night being repaired. Legend says she could only find milk and crackers to feed her family at a cost of $100. Meanwhile, President Davis and his cabinet burned documents and prepared to move the capital to Danville, Virginia. As the Confederate government headed south, they gave orders to burn the armory, bridges, storehouses of tobacco, and other locations. They also gave orders to dump all liquor and scuttle Confederate ships. The city erupted into chaos. Families looted stores of provisions that greedy merchants had hoarded. Whiskey poured through the streets, to which many men helped themselves. Tobacco flames surged through the alcohol-laden streets and whipped out of control. More than 900 businesses and homes burned down. The order to destroy Confederate ships also had unintended results. Thousands of artillery shells stored on the boats exploded and rained further devastation on the city. The next day, April 3rd, the Union Army occupied the city, led by an African-American regiment. President Lincoln visited Richmond on the 4th, and everyone knew the end was in sight. Confederate troops had fled the city, hoping to meet up with what remained of the army farther south. President Davis approved arming slaves to fight. General Grant sent General Lee a message begging him to surrender and end the bloodshed. But Lee held out hope that the last 9,000 men under his command could keep up the fight until the slaves joined them, especially if he could reach his supply train at Appomattox Courthouse. General Lee and his cavalry arrived at the train station on April 8th, where they were quickly surrounded. By 8:30 in the morning, Lee sent messengers to inform Grant that he was ready to surrender. On April 9th, General Grant and General Lee met at a home in the town of Appomattox Courthouse to determine the terms of surrender. Lee requested that all the men be allowed to take their horses, which they owned, and Grant conceded, recognizing that they wouldn't be able to plant their fields without the animals. In his memoirs, Grant recalled how he had admired a ceremonial sword Lee was wearing. Traditionally, a surrendering commander would give his sword to the other general, implying that Lee brought it with him for this purpose. But Lee left the house with the beautiful sword, and his officers were likewise allowed to keep their own sidearms as a matter of honor. The Confederate Army was given food from the supply trains. Lee left the house in tears, commenting to soldiers on the lawn, "Men, we have fought through the war together. I have done the best that I could for you." When Grant's men began to cheer, he reprimanded them and reminded them that the Confederates were their countrymen. On April 12, 1865, nearly 30,000 Confederates paraded in a silent, formal ceremony. They were saluted before stacking their arms and allowed to return home in peace. Though it was a few weeks before all parts of the Confederate Army were rounded up, the war was over.
So the war is over, but what you have to always remember is that does not mean everything is okay. 5 days after the surrender, President Lincoln is assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, his vice president, takes over. He gives a speech saying that this is the end. There's peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority. It now exists in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. And that's what we hope for, and that's now what they try to get within the Reconstruction.